Hi everybody, today we're going to be working on a factoring practice sheet, and this is just going to be a little review sheet for you guys because tomorrow you're going to be having your first assessment. Everything you see on today's review sheet is going to be familiar to you. Nothing is new. As of now, we have done 4 different types of factoring methods. Your first factoring method, which is greatest common factor, GCF, I want you to take note, you should always look for GCF first, okay? If it's not GCF, then you're going to move on to saying, okay, could it be the difference of 2 perfect squares? Well, the difference of 2 perfect squares must have 2 terms because there's 2 of them, and there must be subtraction because it's the difference of 2 squares. If it's not that, you can move on to potentially grouping. Grouping must have 4 terms. So if you're not looking at 4 terms, it can't be grouping. And your last one is trinomials, which could have 3 terms. Now just be careful. GCF could have 2 terms or 3 terms. So you really have to be careful. Okay, so let's take a look at number 1. In number 1, when you have x squared minus 10x plus 24, is there a greatest common factor between an x squared, a 10x, and a 24? No, they don't all have a number in common, and they all don't have an x in common. It can't be the difference of 2 squares because there's 3 terms, which means it can't be grouping because there's 3 terms, so it has to be a trinomial. So here's where you're going to immediately open up 2 sets of parentheses. You're going to pull positive 24 off to the side and ask yourself, what 2 numbers multiply to 24? Now, if it's a positive 24, your signs should be the same. If you were doing 2 and 12, they would never add to 10. They would add to 14 or even negative 2 and negative 12, which would add to negative 14. So it has to be 4 and 6. 4 and 6 add to positive 10, but if you use negative 4 and negative 6, those add to negative 10. So x minus 4, x minus 6 should be your answer, which is choice 4. In number 2, when you look at 6x minus 42, you should be, so I'm just going to write up here, sorry, I'm going backwards. This should be a trinomial. Okay, for number 2, when I look at 6x minus 42, the first thing I'm looking for is a greatest common factor. And this has a GCF. The greatest common factor between a 6x and a 42 is 6. That GCF has to come out in front. Open up now your parentheses. Leave a little room for yourself because what you're going to do is divide each term by 6. You couldn't pull out 6x because 42 doesn't have an x. When you divide each term by 6, you get x minus 7. That's your answer. 6 times x minus 7. Okay. When we take a look at number 3, you have m squared minus 12m minus 64. So here, there's no greatest common factor between all 3. They don't all have an m. Can't be the difference of 2 squares. There's 3 terms. And it can't be grouping because there's 3 terms. So it's a basic trinomial. Open your 2 sets of parentheses. M and m are going to come down in front. I'm going to pull off a negative 64, which means my signs, if it's negative, must be different. In other words, one sign must be a positive and the other sign must be a negative, which means number 1 can't be the case. Okay, number 2 could. Could it be positive 8 and negative 8? They multiply to negative 64, but if I added those together, I would get 0. Can't be my answer. So now let's take a look at 16 or negative 16 and positive 4. Do they add to negative 12? Yes, that's it. Minus 16 plus 4. If you did it the other way, positive 16 and negative 4, those add to positive 12. We needed it to be negative 12. So your answer is choice 3. Okay. Coming up into number 4, immediately, how many terms do you see? 4 terms. There only one type of factoring you could use with 4 terms, and that would be grouping. This has to be grouping. So that means I'm going to group my first 2 terms and my second 2 terms together. It's just double GCF. Find the greatest common factor between 4x cubed and 6x squared. The GCF between 4 and 6 is 2. The GCF between x cubed and x squared is x squared. You pull down the lowest exponent. Now, I'm going to divide each of those terms by my GCF. But notice my GCF is out in front. When I divide 4 by 2, I get 2. When I divide x cubed by x squared, subtract your exponents, I just get an x. Plus 6 divided by 2 is 3. And when I divide x squared by x squared, they divide into 1. It's gone. Remember here, this middle sign, negative, must come down with your GCF. Now, this is a good one. When you have a 2x and a 3, they have nothing in common, but we have to pull down a number. So instead of just leaving it a negative, pull down a -1. When I divide each of these by -1, negative 2x divided by -1 is a positive 2x. Negative 3 divided by -1 is a positive 3. So now I know I did it correctly because these 2 terms match. That makes your first factor, or one of your factors. The order of the factors doesn't matter. Your other factor here is the 2x squared and the -1. That forms your other factor. There's your answer. 2x plus 3 times 2x squared minus 1. Okay. When you look at your next term, 64 minus x squared, the first thing I want to say to you is that I only see 2 terms and I see subtraction in the middle. I'm thinking it's got to be the difference of 2 squares, but just double check. Is there a GCF between them? No. And if you look at your choices, there's no GCF out in front. This is the difference of 2 squares, which means open 2 sets of parentheses. If you notice, your factors must be the same, except the only difference is there are going to be 1 plus, 1 minus in the middle. Now just take note, you see how 64 comes first? Well, the square root of 64, which is 8, not 32. A lot of you are dividing by 2. You take the square root of the number. Here becomes 8. Now x squared, you only take, technically you're taking the square root, but to take the square root, you just take half the exponent. Okay, and half the exponent would just be x plus x minus x. And your answer should be choice 2. You can't say choice 4. If the 64 is up front, the 8 has to be up front. Okay. I am going into number 6. There's no greatest common factor. It can't be the difference of 2 squares, and it can't be grouping. This is a basic trinomial. The only big difference is, notice, you have x to the 4th. So here, when you open up your 2 sets of parentheses, instead of just an x comes down, x squared comes down. You're going to pull off that positive 25, and you're going to ask yourself, name 2 numbers that multiply to 25 and that add to -10. They have to both be -5. So when you put those in, x squared minus 5 times x squared minus 5 would be your answer. Okay, going on to the next page. Okay, let's talk about 9x squared minus 100. Anything you notice about a 9 and 100, red flag should be flying. X squared, and there's a minus in the middle. This has to be the difference of 2 squares. Open up your 2 sets of parentheses. 9 is a perfect square. The square root of 9 is 3. Okay, square root of 9 is 3. If I put an x squared in there as well, the square root of x squared is x. So 3x and 3x go to the front of each parenthesis. One has to be a plus, one has to be a minus. The order of the plus and the minus doesn't matter. Now, a lot of you were putting 50. What's the square root of 100? 10. 10 goes outside. So you need 3x plus 10, 3x minus 10. There it is, choice 2. Okay. GCF is going to be tough. This is nice because they at least tell us they're looking for the greatest common factor. So let's talk about the greatest common factor. Now, in this answer, in this question, they are not giving it to you as a whole term with a plus or a minus in the middle. They just want you to compare 12 and 16, x squared and x, y to the fourth, and y squared. So what is the greatest common factor that goes into 12 and 16? Again, I could just come off to the side quick and say, okay, 12. 1 goes in, 2 goes in, 3 goes in, 4 goes in, 6 goes in, 12 goes in. I'm going to do the same thing with 16. 1, 2, 4, 8, and 16. So what is their greatest common factor? They both have 4 in common. 4 comes down as the GCF. Now, when I look at x squared and x, always pull down the lowest exponent when it comes to variables and exponents. Okay? Pull down the lowest exponent. As long as they have the variable in common. If I have an x squared and an x, only an x can come down. Same thing, if I have a y to the fourth and a y squared can come down. And that's your answer. The GCF is 4xy squared. Okay, so now let's factor GCF with that expression. So a little different from number 8. I am going to find the GCF. Okay, the GCF between 2 and 26 is 2. I can't pull down an x because 26 doesn't have an x. But now I open a parenthesis. And now I have to divide each term by 2. And I get x minus 13. So in example number 9, GCF, I have an answer of 2 times x minus 13. Okay, in number, well, it's still number 9, but the difference of 2 perfect squares, open your 2 sets of parentheses and take the square root of each. The square root of 49a squared is 7a. 7a comes to the front of each parenthesis. I don't care your order, 1 plus, 1 minus. Now take the square root of 25b squared, 5b, 5b. Same exact factor, 7a minus 5b, 7a plus 5b. Only difference, different signs. Okay, take a look at these last two. When we are doing a basic trinomial, that means we're going to open up 2 sets of parentheses. It means positive 28 is coming off to the side. X can go in the front of each term. I want to know what multiplies to 28 and adds to 11. Well, I don't know. 2 and 14, are they going to add to 11? No. 1 and 28? No. 3 doesn't go in. How about 4? Well, 4 and 7. That looks good. They add to 28 and they multiply to 28 and they add to 11. Plus 4, plus 11. Plus 4 and plus 7. Okay, grouping is your last one. You see 4 terms. That's immediately how you know. 4 terms has to be grouping. Group the first 2, group the second 2. So in this one, find the GCF of the first 2. 12 and 3 have a GCF of 3. X cubed and x squared have a GCF of x squared. Divide each of these by that GCF. Divide to get your what's left in parentheses. 4x plus 1. The same thing divided by itself is 1. Here, take note, this is a minus. That means that a minus negative GCF has to come down. The GCF between 8 and 2 has to be a 2. They don't both have an x in common, so now I could divide each of these by negative 2. Negative 8x divided by negative 2 is positive 4x. Negative 2 divided by negative 2, it doesn't cancel out. Anything divided by itself is 1. Okay, this looks good. I have a common factor of 4x plus 1. That's one of my factors. The 2 GCFs, 3x squared and minus 2, create my other factor, and that's my answer. 4x plus 1 times 3x squared minus 2. Okay, guys, that's it. There's your review sheet. Practice this tonight. Tomorrow you will be able to use anything you want in order to help you answer those questions, but I will not post an answer key to the assessment. Okay, study up.